But a little part of this act was, oh, and by the way, we're going to send duties officers, and they can enter any house they want in the colonies to search for goods that they think might be there that maybe were illegally smuggled in. So this ended up being wildly unpopular as well. The people in Boston really were just angry at the British troops. Well, not the British troops, they weren't there yet, but they're angry at Britain, angry at the taxes, and things started happening. Like, for instance, every year there was something called Pope Day. And Pope Day was a celebration going back to this thing in England involving the Pope. I won't get into the whole thing, but essentially what would happen is these gangs, there was a North Side gang and the South Side gang, and they're in Boston, and they would team up to have a good game fight every year. They would make a wagon, and they put an effigy of the Pope, and behind it they put an effigy of the devil, the idea being that the devil controls the Pope. Very much anti-Catholic. And they would get in these wagons, and they'd ride around, these gangs, like lawless criminal gangs, would be riding around Boston. And eventually, at some point in the day, they would meet, just by chance, that they would meet on the streets. And that's when the fight broke out. Not a staged fight, not a play fight, a real, honest-to-goodness fight, as they would fight to capture the other team's Pope. And they'd be hitting each other, and they'd be punching and fighting and kicking, and in fact, one year somebody was killed. Every year there was injuries from this thing, but one year somebody was actually killed. So, the minds such as John Adams got together and they said, what we'll do is we'll co-opt this. We'll get these gangs to combine, and instead of having a Pope's Day, we'll just have them, you know, maybe start a little trouble. Well, that trouble ended up being that these gangs got together and they went and they found the person who was selling the royal stamps, who was distributing them, and they tore his house out. They pounded down the door, and they went in, and they took everything off the walls. They stole all his money. They stole all his papers and books that he collected over years. They carted them all off. And so this guy's writing back to England saying, you know, my house has been sacked. I've lost all my stuff. I'm penniless. What are you going to do? Other things were happening, too. A merchant who was daring to sell goods that he had paid duties for was, well, they would put signs outside these merchants' businesses saying, these merchants are cooperating with Britain, they're cooperating with these taxes, don't buy anything from these merchants. Well, some of the merchants decided to sell these goods anyway, and an angry mob chased one of them into his house, and were throwing rocks in his house. Eventually one of the rocks went through his window, hit his wife on the head, so he pulls a musket out of the upstairs window and says, everybody get back. They're saying, no, we're not going to get back, come out here. And he shoots into the crowd, and he kills a boy. And then the mob really gets angry, and they drag him off to jail. So England decides that they have got to take action. Great Britain sends 2 units to Boston, to occupy Boston, to be a standing army in Boston. And right away, the legal proceedings, John Adams, the lawyer, and other lawyers that were involved in Boston started trying to find ways to undermine these troops, in legal ways, in argumentative ways. The troops arrived, they say, we want quarter. The law, that they had to provide these troops with a place to stay. But the lawyers said, well, really we don't, because the law says that once the barracks are full, then we have to house the troops. But, there's this castle out like about 5 miles out into the water. There's this island. And there's Castle William, and that has plenty of space. So put the troops out there in the castle. Well, they couldn't do that. So they ended up just camping outdoors in tents and eventually found some public spaces where the troops could camp. And Boston quickly became just a crazy, crazy place. The people resented these troops. You had thousands of troops in a city of about 20,000. The people, if they were walking around at night, they would, be walking the streets of Boston, you'd hear, halt, who goes there? You look up, and there's a guy with a red coat, and he's pointing a gun at you with a bayonet on the end of it, and this is very uncomfortable. You couldn't even walk the streets at night without being accosted. On top of that, the troops often had nothing to do. They had very little money, so they would apply for jobs, which meant jobs for going to the troops instead of the people in Boston who really wanted these jobs. Consequently, there was a lot of fighting, a lot of conflict, a lot of back and forth between the troops and the people. People would sometimes throw things at the troops and run. Just all the typical insurgency type of things that you would expect. And of course, people were predicting that this was going to be problems. There was going to be something bad that was going to happen. And sure enough, there was. One day, something happened called what we refer to now as the Boston Massacre. A soldier was standing guard, private white, and an officer was walking by, and a boy insulted, just a boy on the street, 12-year-old. They would call the soldiers lobsters and stuff like that because of their red coats. Like, hey, lobster. And he shouted some insult, insinuating the man owed money to his dad or something like that. And the private stepped up and said, no, it's not true. This officer, I'll have you know, is a gentleman. And the boy shouted back, there are no gentlemen in the British Army. And the private took the butt of his rifle and he brought it down on the boy's face, and the boy fell around and kind of got back up. He wasn't seriously injured, but several people saw it happen, and they started yelling at the soldier. And after the officer had walked on by, the crowd started gathering around the private and yelling at him and threatening him and saying, how could you do this? How could you strike a child? And the soldier got really nervous and he put the bayonet on his musket, and he loaded it and he backed up against the nearest building, and he was fending them off, and the crowd got bigger and bigger, and they were pressuring the soldier and getting closer and saying, fire, fire, we dare you, fire. And then the fire bells started ringing in the town somewhere, because there was also fights in other parts of the town. There was various fights going on. And instead of everybody running out with buckets of water because the fire bells are ringing, mysteriously, they all ran out with weapons. It seems like somebody had maybe organized that when the fire bell rings next time, maybe it's not a fire, maybe it's time to have weapons. And so now there's a bunch of soldiers milling around Boston. There's a bunch of civilians with weapons milling around, and little fights are breaking out all over Boston on the night of the Boston Massacre. In nearby barracks, an officer heard Private White yelling for help. And he looked over and you could see that Private White was between a large hostile crowd and the building, with his back to the building. And the last thing that Thomas Preston, that was the officer, the last thing that Officer Preston wanted to do was march a bunch of troops into a hostile crowd. Because at least during this whole occupation, this whole 5-month occupation, they had never shot anybody. A lot of different things, a lot of different little violence here and there, but none of the soldiers had actually shot any of the people. And they were trying to avoid doing any such thing. But on the other hand, you could see this private was trapped. He couldn't just leave his man out there. So Captain Preston got 7 of his men together, and he marched them right up to the crowd. And he told them to stand in the line between the crowd and the building. And at some point, they all started loading their guns. And they raised them up and aimed them at the people with the bayonets attached. And the people didn't just run though, because the people knew that these troops could not fire. The people knew that the British did not want any shootings to happen from the soldiers. So they continued to crowd closer and closer to the British troops. Somebody came up to Captain Preston and said, please don't do this. I see that you have muskets loaded. Don't shoot anybody. And Captain Preston said, why would I tell them to shoot anybody? Look, I'm standing between, my men are behind me. If they start firing into the crowd, bullets are going to go right through me. I do not want any bloodshed.